I want to start out here by telling you a quick story. Many of you have heard this before, but our story begins on a Friday the 13th, which should be a clue to the kind of story this is going to be. Now, I'm not a superstitious man, but had I known what was in store for me that particular night, I think I would have called in sick. Now, at the time, I was about 2 years into my marriage with my wife, who at this time was about 4 months pregnant with our first child, and life was going very well. I had just received my paramedic license in the mail that very morning, and things were going according to plan, better than I could have hoped. But as Murphy's Law states, if something can go wrong, eventually it will. So I'm working as an EMT this particular night, and it's about 11 o'clock, very dark. My partner's driving the ambulance. I'm half asleep in the passenger seat, and we just finished a long-distance transport. We're on our way back to our station, going down the highway at about 65 miles an hour. It is a very rural area, nothing but trees and farmland as far as the eye could see. Well, all of a sudden, my partner breaks the silence and shouts, "Is that a horse?" And I look up, and the last thing I remember seeing is the face of a 2,000-pound draft horse coming through the windshield right on top of me. And then everything went dark. The next thing I recall is waking up about 30 minutes after the collision, confused and shrouded in darkness. My face was covered in blood and broken glass, blood streaming into my eyes and my mouth from a laceration on my forehead. And as I slowly begin to regain consciousness, I become aware that my partner is holding my head in line. He tells me that we've been in an accident. And then he tells me how it happened, that we had hit a horse. And having a concussion especially, I honestly believed I was dreaming. I repeatedly made the statement, "This cannot be real, this is not happening, this is all a dream." None of it made any sense. And at the time, I had no idea where I was. I couldn't even tell that I was sitting inside an ambulance. The cab was unrecognizable and every light was out. But despite my confusion, one thing did not escape my attention for even a moment, and that was the pain. This excruciating, fiery pain across the entire left side of my body. I look down and find that my left wrist is badly angulated and swollen. My side of the ambulance had been ripped apart as though it were made of tinfoil. Interestingly, my partner was treated and released at the scene with minor cuts and bruises. I took the full force. I was flown to a hospital in Quincy, Illinois, where it was determined that I had suffered a concussion, as well as several broken bones, including 4 bones in my wrist, as well as a fracture of my left scapula. And I was also told that my neck was broken at C5. Now, I remember thinking, that's impossible. My neck doesn't even hurt. But I'm going to put a question up here just to see what you guys think. Why is it, oh, I'm sorry, I didn't have a question for this, but just in the back of your mind, answer this question for me. Why do you suppose I didn't feel any pain in my neck? You probably answered this question immediately without hesitation. I had a distracting injury. The pain in my wrist was so severe that even if I had been experiencing pain in my neck, it was essentially overridden by the other pain in my body. Well, another blackout, and I wake up at Barnes South. There's a nurse practitioner in the room holding a CT film in her hand. When she lifts it up to the light, this is what I saw. I had a teardrop fracture of my fifth cervical vertebrae with posterior displacement of C5 and C6. My spinal cord was compressed on one side, bulged on the other. Literally, I had come millimeters away from death, or at the very minimum, paralysis. What they believe happened is, as the horse came through the windshield, I raised my left hand to shield myself. The horse impacted my wrist. Wrist came down on top of my head, causing the fracture to the bones of my wrist and compression and the fracture of my fifth cervical vertebrae. And the force continued to travel down through my body, ultimately causing the fracture in my left scapula. Quite a bit of force to cause that kind of injury. So in the hospital, I was told that between the damage to my neck and my hand, I would in all likelihood never be able to work again, not even as a telemarketer, let alone as a paramedic. I was told to forget about that. In fact, the surgeon told me that because my cervical injury was so unstable, there was a very real chance that I would come away from the surgery paralyzed. And so what is it about a teardrop fracture that makes it so unstable? Well, with other types of spinal fractures, this structure called the posterior longitudinal ligament remains intact and basically continues holding your spine in alignment, preventing vertebrae from shifting into the spinal canal. Well, in my case, this ligament was disrupted. Teardrop fractures are very rare, making up only about 15% of all C-spine fractures. And 91% of people who have this kind of fracture will suffer severe neurological damage, including anterior cord syndrome, which we'll discuss in more detail later, which manifests as quadriplegia and a loss of pain and temperature sensation below the level of the injury. Something else that I had been at risk for because of where my injury site was damage to the phrenic nerve. You probably remember the saying from as far back as EMT school that C3, 4, and 5 keep the diaphragm alive. And the phrenic nerve comes out of the spine somewhere in that region of C3, 4, and 5. So there was a possibility that my phrenic nerve could have been damaged too, which would have cut off innervation to the diaphragm, your major muscle for breathing, which would have left me with not much more than my intercostal muscles, accessory muscles to breathe. And because it took almost 30 minutes for another ambulance to arrive at my accident scene, I, in all likelihood, would have been dead before they could have arrived. So thank God I dodged that bullet. This is the one and only picture of me in the hospital, and that is because I specifically told everyone that I did not want any photographs taken. I mean, this was a devastating event. In what world would I ever want to have some memento of this day in my life? Now, don't let the grin on my face, the brave face there, fool you. I was doped up on so much Dilaudid that I had no idea there was a camera in the room at this point in time. And my father-in-law evidently did not get the memo about no pictures to be taken. Thus, the reason why we have this today. Long story short, I went through an anterior-posterior fusion of C4, 5, and 6. This is me today. There is nothing left of C5. Instead, I have quite a bit of hardware, brackets, and screws, along with, if you see this rectangular structure here, that is a bone. It's just not mine. It is a donor bone. I'm told it's actually a portion of a leg bone, a tibia, I believe it was, from a cadaver. So someone's leg bone is in my neck. Now, by the grace of God, I came through everything unscathed, obviously. 6 months from the day of the accident, and I was back on the truck. So definitely a miracle in my estimation.